In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns and families went about their daily routines, an event unfolded that would soon capture national attention. It was an ordinary evening, the kind where nothing seemed out of place. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the area. Birds chirped softly in the background, and the faint hum of distant conversations filled the air. Everything appeared calm, until it wasn't. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes, a decorated black U.S. Navy admiral with more than 2 decades of service, was driving home after attending a military conference. He had spent the day discussing strategies and sharing insights with fellow officers, proud to represent his country in yet another capacity. His navy blues had been swapped for casual civilian clothes, a simple polo shirt and slacks, and he drove a modest sedan, a car chosen, not for show but for practicality. To anyone who didn't know him, he looked like just another resident returning from work. As Hayes approached a 4-way stop sign near the edge of the neighborhood, he noticed flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Slowing down, he pulled over to the side of the road, assuming it was a routine traffic stop. Perhaps he had unknowingly exceeded the speed limit or made some minor driving error. Whatever the reason, Hayes remained calm. He turned off the engine, rolled down his window, and waited patiently for the officer to approach. The officer who walked up to Hayes's car was Officer Greg Dawson, a white police officer known in the department for his aggressive style of policing. Dawson had been on duty for several hours already, responding to calls ranging from noise complaints to suspected break-ins. Over time, he had developed a reputation among colleagues for being thorough, though some whispered that his methods often crossed into unnecessary force. Tonight, however, Dawson wasn't thinking about reputations or consequences. He was focused solely on the task at hand. When Dawson reached Hayes's vehicle, he leaned down slightly to peer inside. "License and registration, please," he said, his tone clipped and authoritative. Hayes nodded politely, reaching into his pocket to retrieve his wallet. As he did so, he explained, "Officer, I believe I may have gone a little over the speed limit back there. If that's the case, I apologize. I wasn't paying close enough attention." Dawson frowned, ignoring Hayes's attempt at civility. Instead of acknowledging the explanation, he asked sharply, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Hayes hesitated, unsure how to respond. He hadn't done anything wrong beyond possibly speeding, which seemed like a minor infraction at worst. Deciding honesty was the best policy, he replied. "Not exactly, sir. Could you clarify?" This answer only deepened Dawson's suspicion. Something about Hayes, the way he spoke, the confidence in his voice, even the cleanliness of his car, set off alarm bells in the officer's mind. Without further explanation, Dawson demanded Hayes step out of the vehicle. Confused but compliant, Hayes opened the door and stepped onto the curb, keeping his hands visible as instructed. "What's going on here?" Hayes asked, trying to maintain a calm demeanor despite growing unease. Dawson ignored the question, and instead began patting him down, searching for weapons or contraband. Finding nothing, he barked, "Who are you? What's your story?" Hayes, taken aback by the sudden escalation, decided it was time to clarify matters once and for all. Reaching carefully into his wallet, he pulled out his military ID card and held it up for Dawson to see. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes, United States Navy. I've served my country for over 20 years. I assure you there's no need for this level of scrutiny." But instead of easing tensions, Hayes's words seemed to inflame them. Dawson snatched the ID from his hand, scrutinizing it closely. For a moment, doubt flickered across his face, but then it hardened again. "This could be fake," he muttered, under his breath. "How do I know you're really who you say you are?" Hayes felt a surge of frustration. Here he was, a decorated naval officer, being treated as if he were a criminal. He tried reasoning with Dawson, explaining that his credentials were legitimate and offering to call his commanding officer to verify his identity, but Dawson refused to listen. Instead, he handcuffed Hayes and placed him under arrest, accusing him of impersonating an officer. By now, curious neighbors had begun gathering on sidewalks and porches, drawn by the commotion. Some watched silently, while others recorded the scene on their phones. A few shouted questions at Dawson, asking why he was arresting someone who clearly appeared to be a respected member of society. But Dawson ignored them all, focusing solely on Hayes. As Hayes sat in the back seat of the patrol car, his mind raced. How had things spiraled so quickly out of control? He replayed the events in his head, searching for any misstep that might have led to this outcome. Had he said something wrong? Moved too suddenly? Nothing made sense. All he could think about was how surreal the situation felt. One moment, he was simply a man driving home, and the next, he was accused of a crime he hadn't committed. Meanwhile, news vans started arriving, alerted by social media posts from witnesses who had filmed parts of the encounter. Reporters scrambled to piece together what had happened, interviewing bystanders and snapping photos of the scene. By the time Hayes was taken to the station, the story was already spreading like wildfire online. Headlines screamed variations of Navy Admiral arrested during traffic stop, accompanied by grainy images of Hayes sitting in the patrol car, his expression unreadable. Back at the station, Hayes was processed and placed in a holding cell. Despite the humiliation, he maintained his composure, knowing that losing his temper would only make matters worse. Hours passed before his commanding officers intervened, demanding his release based on his impeccable record and undeniable identity. When Hayes finally walked out of the station, blinking in the bright lights of cameras and microphones, he knew his life, and the lives of those involved, would never be the same again. What had started as a routine traffic stop had transformed into something far greater, a catalyst for conversations about race, authority, and justice in America. And though Hayes couldn't have predicted it at the time, this single incident would ripple outward, touching countless lives and sparking movements that would shape the nation for years to come. By the time Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes stepped out of the police station, the world already knew his name. The video footage of his arrest had gone viral overnight, spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. People watched, in disbelief as they saw a decorated naval officer, someone who had dedicated his life to serving his country, treated like a common criminal. The clip showed Dawson's aggressive demeanor and Hayes's calm attempts to explain himself, creating a stark contrast that left viewers outraged. Within hours, hashtags like Justice for Hayes and Respect Our Heroes began trending on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Memes, infographics, and opinion pieces flooded the internet, dissecting every detail of the incident. Some posts highlighted Hayes's impressive military record, showcasing photos of him receiving medals for bravery during overseas missions. Others pointed out the absurdity of accusing such a high-ranking officer of impersonation. Comment sections buzzed with anger, disbelief, and calls for accountability. The story quickly transcended the digital realm, making its way onto major news networks. Cable TV anchors debated the implications of the arrest, inviting legal experts, civil rights activists, and former law enforcement officials to weigh in. Talk shows hosted heated discussions about racial profiling and systemic bias within policing. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist addressing the situation, using humor to underscore the ridiculousness of what had happened. "You'd think someone wearing a medal would get a free pass," one joked, though the laughter carried an undercurrent of sadness. As the narrative gained momentum, protesters took to the streets. In cities across the nation, thousands gathered outside, police departments holding signs that read, "End racial profiling and stand with Admiral Hayes." Marches were peaceful but passionate, with chants echoing through neighborhoods. No justice, no peace. Families brought their children, teachers walked alongside students, and veterans joined arms with civilians. The unity was palpable, a testament to how deeply this single event resonated with people from all walks of life. Meanwhile, journalists dug deeper into both men's backgrounds. For Hayes, the revelations painted a picture of dedication and integrity. Interviews with colleagues described him as a natural leader, respected not only for his tactical skills but also for his compassion. Stories emerged of him mentoring younger sailors, advocating for mental health awareness in the military, and volunteering in underserved communities during his leave. His wife, Dr. Elena Hayes, spoke briefly to reporters, calling her husband a man of principle, and urging the public to focus on the bigger issues at play rather than vilifying individuals. On the other hand, Officer Greg Harrison's past came under intense scrutiny. Anonymous sources leaked documents detailing a troubling pattern of behavior. Reports surfaced of multiple complaints filed against him by minority residents, alleging excessive force or unjustified stops. One case involved a young black teenager who claimed Dawson had pulled him over for no reason, searched his car, and berated him before letting him go without issuing a ticket. Another recounted how Dawson had detained a Latina mother in front of her children, accusing her of theft despite lacking evidence. These stories painted a portrait of an officer whose actions often seemed driven by prejudice rather than protocol. Public pressure mounted rapidly. Local officials held emergency meetings to address the growing unrest. The mayor of the town where the arrest occurred issued a statement condemning the incident and promising transparency in the investigation. Meanwhile, petitions demanding Dawson's immediate termination garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures. Activist groups organized rallies outside the police department, refusing to disperse until action was taken. For Hayes, the attention was overwhelming. Friends and family rallied around him, offering support and encouragement, but the constant spotlight weighed heavily on his shoulders. Every knock on his door could be a reporter seeking comment. Every ring of his phone might bring another interview. Request. At first he tried to ignore it, focusing instead on returning to his normal routine. But normalcy felt impossible when strangers recognized him in grocery stores or approached him on the street to express solidarity. His commanding officers reached out, assuring him of their unwavering support while cautioning him about navigating the situation carefully. They reminded him that his actions, or lack thereof, could influence public perception and potentially impact policy changes. Though grateful for their backing, Hayes struggled to reconcile his personal feelings with the broader implications of his experience. He wanted justice, yes, but he also feared becoming a symbol rather than a person. One evening, sitting on the porch with his wife, Hayes finally broke down. "I just wanted to come home," he said quietly, staring at the horizon. "I wasn't trying to make a statement or start a movement. I was just driving." Elena placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know, Marcus, but sometimes these things choose us. You have a chance to do something meaningful here, to help prevent this from happening to someone else." Her words lingered in his mind long after their conversation ended. She was right, of course. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever been wrongfully targeted because of the color of their skin. It was about dismantling systems that allowed such injustices to persist. And if Hayes didn't speak up now, who would? Back in the small apartment he had moved to after being suspended, Dawson faced a very different reality. Once a figure of authority and respect in his community, he now found himself isolated and vilified. Death threats poured into his inbox daily, forcing him to change his phone number and email address repeatedly. Friends stopped returning his calls, and neighbors avoided eye contact when passing him on the street. Even his own family distanced themselves, ashamed of the scrutiny surrounding his name. Desperate to salvage his reputation, Dawson hired a high-profile attorney to defend him. Together, they crafted a strategy aimed at portraying the arrest as a misunderstanding rather than an act of malice. In interviews, Dawson claimed he had simply been following procedure, insisting that anyone in his position would have acted similarly given the circumstances. "I didn't know who he was," Dawson argued. "How was I supposed to believe he was really a Navy admiral?" But the public wasn't buying it. Leaked body cam footage contradicted his claims, showing moments where Hayes had clearly identified himself as a naval officer yet was ignored. Social media users dissected the video frame by frame, pointing out inconsistencies in Dawson's account. Critics accused him of doubling down on lies rather than owning up to his mistakes. The more he defended himself, the more entrenched public opinion became against him. Eventually, the disciplinary hearing arrived. Held behind closed doors, it lasted several days with testimony from witnesses, analysis of the body cam footage, and arguments from both sides. When the verdict was announced, it came as no surprise. Dawson was fired from the force, stripped of his badge and pension. The decision sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies nationwide, sparking debates about accountability and reform. For Hayes, the outcome brought a measure of relief, but not closure. Knowing that Dawson had been held accountable didn't erase the pain of being treated like a suspect. It didn't undo the humiliation of being paraded in handcuffs or the sleepless nights spent wondering why this had happened to him. Yet, amidst the turmoil, he found glimmers of hope. People were talking. Conversations about race and policing were happening in ways they hadn't before. Policies were being reevaluated, training programs revamped, and grassroots movements strengthened. And so, as the dust began to settle, Hayes realized that perhaps his ordeal had served a greater purpose. While he hadn't asked for this role, he understood now that he had a responsibility to use it wisely. Whether through advocacy, education, or simply sharing his story, he vowed to keep pushing for change, for himself, for others, and for future generations. Because sometimes, even in the darkest moments, light can emerge. The days following the disciplinary hearing were a whirlwind for Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes. While the verdict against Officer Dawson brought a sense of vindication, it didn't erase the emotional toll the incident had taken on him. The world continued to watch his every move, dissecting his words and actions as if he were a character in an unfolding drama. For Hayes, though, this wasn't a story. It was his life, raw and unfiltered. And living under such intense scrutiny came with its own set of challenges. Hayes tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, resuming his duties within the Navy and spending time with his family. But the cracks began to show. Friends noticed that he seemed quieter than usual, often lost in thought during conversations. Colleagues who once marveled at his ability to lead with confidence now saw hesitation in his eyes. Even his wife, Dr. Elena Hayes, observed subtle changes in his behavior. He would retreat to their porch late at night, staring into the distance as if searching for answers to questions no one else could hear. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, Elena sat beside him and gently asked, "What's going through your mind, Marcus?" Hayes sighed deeply before responding. "I keep thinking about how easily it all fell apart," he admitted. "One moment, I'm driving home like any other day. The next, I'm sitting in a jail cell, wondering if anyone will believe me when I say I'm innocent." Elena listened intently, her heart breaking for the man she loved. "You are innocent," she reminded him firmly, "and people know that now. What happened to you was wrong. There's no denying it. But you can't let it define you." Her words struck a chord, but they also sparked something deeper within Hayes. Over the next few weeks, he began reflecting on what it meant to be defined by an experience, rather than allowing it to shape his future. He realized that while he couldn't change what had happened, he could decide how to respond moving forward. That realization became the turning point in his journey toward healing. As the public spotlight remained fixed on him, invitations poured in from organizations eager to hear his perspective. Universities wanted him to speak at conferences about racial profiling. Civil rights groups sought his involvement in campaigns aimed at reforming law enforcement practices. Media outlets offered lucrative deals for exclusive interviews or book rights. At first, Hayes declined most requests, feeling overwhelmed by the attention, but Elena encouraged him to consider the bigger picture. "Marcus," she said one morning over coffee, "you have a platform now. People are listening, not just because of what happened to you, but because of who you are. You've spent your entire career serving others. Why stop now?" Her encouragement gave Hayes pause. He thought about all the people who had reached out to share their own stories of discrimination and injustice. Some were veterans like him, others were civilians who had faced similar encounters with law enforcement. Each message carried a plea. Don't let this moment pass without doing something meaningful. With Elena's support, Hayes decided to step into the role of advocate, not because he craved fame or recognition, but because he believed he owed it to those who had stood by him during his darkest hour. His first major appearance came at a human rights summit held in Washington, D.C., where leaders from various fields gathered to discuss systemic racism and inequality. As he walked onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause, rising to their feet in a standing ovation. It was a surreal moment, one that left Hayes momentarily speechless. When he finally spoke, his voice resonated with authenticity and conviction. "I never imagined I'd be standing here today," he began, looking out at the sea of faces before him. "Not because I doubted my abilities, but because I never expected to become a symbol of anything. I'm just a man, a husband, a father, a sailor who loves his country and believes in the promise of justice for all." He went on to recount the events of that fateful evening, describing the confusion, frustration, and fear he felt during the arrest. But rather than dwell on the negatives, he shifted the focus to hope. "What happened to me isn't unique," he explained. "It's part of a larger pattern that affects millions of people across this nation. And while my story has drawn attention to the issue, we must remember that true progress requires more than awareness. It demands action." Hayes outlined specific steps he believed could drive meaningful change: mandatory implicit bias training for law enforcement officers, increased accountability measures for misconduct, and greater community engagement between police departments and the populations they serve. He emphasized the importance of empathy, urging listeners to put themselves in others' shoes and recognize the humanity behind every badge or uniform. By the end of his speech, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Attendees approached him afterward, thanking him for his courage and expressing admiration for his vision. Journalists praised his eloquence, calling him a natural leader capable of bridging divides. Yet, despite the accolades, Hayes remained humble. He knew that words alone wouldn't dismantle centuries of systemic oppression. Real change required sustained effort and collaboration. In the months that followed, Hayes threw himself into advocacy work. He partnered with civil rights organizations to launch initiatives aimed at educating both law enforcement officials and the general public about racial bias. One program focused on creating dialogue between police officers and minority communities, fostering mutual understanding and trust. Another provided resources for individuals navigating interactions with law enforcement, offering tips on de-escalation and legal rights. Hayes also made appearances on television shows and podcasts, using these platforms to amplify marginalized voices. He often invited guests, from grassroots activists to fellow veterans, to join him in discussions about race, privilege, and justice. These conversations weren't always easy. Sometimes they exposed deep-seated divisions and uncomfortable truths, but Hayes welcomed the challenge, believing that growth only came through discomfort. Despite his growing influence, Hayes never lost sight of why he had chosen this path. He kept images of his family close, photos of Elena and their children, taped to the corners of his laptop screen, and reminded himself daily that everything he did was for them. Their love anchored him during moments of doubt, giving him the strength to persevere even when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. Of course, not everyone supported his efforts. Critics accused him of exploiting his ordeal for personal gain, dismissing his advocacy as performative. Others argued that systemic issues couldn't be solved by individual actions alone. Hayes acknowledged these concerns, admitting that he didn't have all the answers. "I'm not perfect," he told an interviewer during a particularly candid moment, "but I'm trying. And if my trying inspires someone else to try too, then maybe together we can make a difference." Slowly but surely, Hayes began seeing signs of progress. Lawmakers introduced legislation inspired by his recommendations, mandating reforms in policing practices. Schools incorporated his speeches into curriculums, teaching students about resilience and the power of using adversity as a catalyst for change. Communities rallied around his message, organizing local events to promote unity and equality. Through it all, Hayes remained grounded, drawing strength from the people who had stood by him throughout his journey. Whether it was Elena reminding him of his worth or strangers sending heartfelt messages of gratitude, he found comfort in knowing he wasn't alone. Though scars from that night lingered, both visible and invisible, he chose to see them not as reminders of pain, but as symbols of survival. And so, as the chapters of his life unfolded, Hayes embraced his role as a beacon of hope. He understood that the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but he also knew that every step forward mattered. Because sometimes, even in the face of injustice, one person's courage can spark a movement. And for Hayes, that was enough. Officer Greg Dawson's life unraveled faster than anyone could have predicted. What began as a single, ill-fated decision spiraled into a chain reaction of consequences that left him isolated, disgraced, and grappling with the weight of his actions. For someone who had once prided himself on being a pillar of authority in his community, the fall from grace was both shocking and devastating. In the days following his termination from the police force, Dawson retreated into solitude. The media circus surrounding his case had painted him as a villain, a symbol of everything wrong with law enforcement. His name became synonymous with racial profiling and unchecked bias, splashed across headlines and social media posts alongside harsh criticisms. Friends and colleagues who might have offered support distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the controversy. Even his own family struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the figure vilified in public discourse. Dawson tried to defend himself at first, granting interviews to sympathetic outlets and posting statements online in an attempt to explain his side of the story. "I was just doing my job," he insisted repeatedly. "Anyone in my position would have acted the same way." But these claims fell flat against the backdrop of leaked body cam footage, which showed undeniable moments where Admiral Hayes had calmly identified himself multiple times, only to be ignored or dismissed. Public opinion hardened further, leaving Dawson increasingly desperate and defensive. Without his badge, Dawson found himself adrift. The structure and purpose that policing had provided were suddenly gone, replaced by a void he didn't know how to fill. Bills piled up as his savings dwindled. He had lost not only his job but also his pension, due to the severity of the disciplinary action taken against him. Unable to find employment in law enforcement again, he took whatever odd jobs he could secure, stocking shelves at a local grocery store, cleaning offices late at night, even mowing lawns for neighbors who barely acknowledged him. Each task felt like a blow to his pride, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. The isolation grew unbearable. Once a familiar face in his neighborhood, Dawson now avoided eye contact with passers-by, dreading the whispers and stares that followed him wherever he went. Social gatherings became impossible. Invitations dried up entirely. When he did venture out, people either ignored him or confronted him angrily, accusing him of perpetuating systemic racism. Death threats continued to arrive sporadically, forcing him to change his phone number and email address multiple times. Fear became a constant companion, gnawing at the edges of his mind and making it hard to sleep at night. As weeks turned into months, Dawson began questioning everything about himself, the choices he had made, the beliefs he had held, the system he had served so loyally. At first, these thoughts terrified him. Admitting fault felt like admitting weakness, something he had never allowed himself to do during his years on the force. Yet the more he reflected, the harder it became to ignore the glaring flaws in his behavior that fateful evening. He replayed the traffic stop in his head over and over, dissecting each moment, searching for answers. Why hadn't he listened when Hayes identified himself? Why had suspicion clouded his judgment so completely? Slowly, painfully, Dawson started confronting truths he had long buried. Conversations with a counselor, a requirement imposed during his disciplinary process, forced him to examine his biases and the ways they had influenced his actions. It wasn't easy. Some sessions left him seething with frustration, while others brought tears of shame. But through this grueling process, he began to see patterns in his past behavior that he had previously excused as routine or justified as necessary for the job. He realized that his aggressive tactics, though praised by some superiors, had often targeted minority communities disproportionately. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, the harm those actions had caused, not just to individuals, but to entire neighborhoods. Desperate to rebuild his life, Dawson decided to make amends in whatever small ways he could. He started volunteering at a local shelter, helping serve meals to homeless families and listening to their stories without judgment. Many of the people he met were minorities, individuals who had faced discrimination and hardship throughout their lives. Hearing their experiences firsthand opened Dawson's eyes in ways no training seminar ever had. He saw the humanity behind the statistics, the real faces of those affected by systemic inequities. Though he rarely spoke about his own past, the weight of his guilt drove him to keep showing up day after day, hoping to contribute something positive, even if it was just a few hours of service. Word eventually spread among volunteers and staff about Dawson's background. Some reacted with anger, refusing to work alongside him. Others, however, approached him cautiously, curious about his motivations. One woman, a former teacher named Ruth, struck up conversations with him during shifts, asking probing questions about his journey. Her tone was firm but not unkind, challenging him to think critically about accountability and redemption. "You can't undo what you've done," she told him one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. "But you can choose how to move forward. That's what matters." Her words stuck with Dawson, becoming a mantra of sorts as he navigated his new reality. He knew forgiveness wouldn't come easily, if it came at all. Trust, once broken, was difficult to repair. Still, he clung to the belief that he could at least try to be better, to learn from his mistakes and prevent them from defining the rest of his life. Meanwhile, Dawson's story continued to serve as a cautionary tale within law enforcement circles. Training seminars incorporated his case into discussions about implicit bias and procedural fairness, using his downfall as an example of what could happen when officers failed to uphold justice impartially. Instructors emphasized the importance of listening, verifying information, and treating everyone with dignity, regardless of preconceived notions. Dawson's name became shorthand for the dangers of unchecked prejudice, a reminder of the human cost of failing to act with integrity. Despite these efforts, Dawson remained haunted by guilt. Nights were the hardest when silence pressed down on him and memories of that evening replayed in vivid detail. He wondered if Admiral Hayes ever thought about him, if the man he had wronged harbored resentment or anger. The thought weighed heavily on him, adding another layer of complexity to his already fragile emotional state. Would Hayes ever forgive him? Could anyone? Yet, amidst the turmoil, there were glimmers of hope. A few people, former co-workers, distant relatives, even strangers, reached out to offer encouragement. They acknowledged his mistakes but also recognized his willingness to grow. "Change is possible," one message read. "Keep going." These small acts of kindness gave Dawson strength, reminding him that redemption, though difficult, wasn't entirely out of reach. By the end of the year, Dawson had settled into a quiet, humble existence far removed from the spotlight. He rented a modest apartment in a small town, far from the scrutiny of city life. His days revolved around simple routines: waking early, working odd jobs, volunteering at the shelter, and spending evenings reading books about empathy and understanding. He kept a journal, documenting his reflections and progress, holding himself accountable for staying on the path toward growth. Though scars remained, both visible and invisible, Dawson accepted that healing was a lifelong process. He couldn't erase the pain he had caused, nor could he rewrite history. But he could commit to learning, to serving, and to striving for a future where his actions aligned with the values he now claimed to hold dear. Redemption, he realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a better tomorrow, one step at a time. The ripple effects of Admiral Marcus Hayes' arrest and Officer Greg Dawson's downfall extended far beyond the lives of the two men directly involved. What had started as a single incident, a routine traffic stop gone horribly wrong, had ignited a national conversation about race, power, and accountability in America. The momentum built steadily, fueled by grassroots activism, media coverage, and public demand for change. By the time months turned into years, It was clear that this moment had become a catalyst for broader societal transformation. In the wake of the controversy, lawmakers scrambled to address the growing outcry for reform. Congressional hearings were convened, bringing together civil rights leaders, law enforcement officials, academics, and survivors of police misconduct to discuss solutions. Admiral Hayes, now widely regarded as a voice of reason and resilience, testified before Congress, sharing his personal story while advocating for systemic changes. His testimony struck a chord with legislators, many of whom admitted they had never fully understood the depth of racial bias within policing until hearing firsthand accounts like his. One of the most significant outcomes of these discussions was the passage of landmark legislation aimed at addressing implicit bias in law enforcement. Dubbed the Justice and Accountability Act, the bill mandated comprehensive training programs for all officers, focusing not only on recognizing prejudice, but also on fostering empathy and cultural competence. It required departments to implement stricter oversight mechanisms, including independent review boards to investigate complaints of misconduct. Additionally, the act allocated funding for community engagement initiatives designed to build trust between police forces and the populations they served. While the law marked a major step forward, its implementation faced challenges. Some police unions resisted the reforms, arguing that additional regulations would hinder their ability to do their jobs effectively. Others expressed concerns about the cost of training programs and the logistical hurdles of creating new oversight bodies. Despite these obstacles, public pressure ensured that progress continued. Cities across the country began piloting innovative approaches to policing, such as pairing officers with social workers during certain calls, or adopting technology like body cameras to increase transparency. Admiral Hayes played an instrumental role in promoting these efforts. He traveled extensively, speaking at town halls, universities, and conferences about the importance of bridging divides between communities and law enforcement. His message emphasized collaboration over confrontation, urging both sides to see each other as human beings rather than adversaries. "We can't solve problems by pointing fingers," he often said. "Real change comes when we sit down together, listen to one another, and commit to finding common ground." To support this vision, Hayes partnered with several organizations to launch a program called Bridges of Understanding. The initiative brought together police officers and civilians from diverse backgrounds for workshops and dialogue sessions. Participants engaged in activities designed to break down stereotypes and foster mutual respect. Officers shared their experiences of working under pressure, while community members recounted stories of feeling targeted or mistreated by law enforcement. These exchanges weren't always easy. Emotions ran high, and disagreements occasionally erupted. But the overall impact was profound. Many participants reported leaving the program with a deeper appreciation for perspectives different from their own. Hayes also worked closely with educators to integrate lessons about racial equity and justice into school curriculums. Textbooks began featuring case studies of individuals like him who had used adversity as a platform for advocacy. Teachers incorporated discussions about systemic racism and privilege into classrooms, encouraging students to think critically about how history shapes present-day realities. Young people responded enthusiastically, organizing walkouts, protests, and awareness campaigns to amplify the voices of marginalized groups. For Hayes, seeing this generation rise up gave him hope that lasting change might be possible after all. Meanwhile, Officer Dawson's case became a cornerstone of training seminars for new recruits. Instructors used his story to illustrate the dangers of unchecked bias and the importance of verifying information before taking action. Body cam footage from the night of Hayes' arrest was shown during classes, prompting intense debates among cadets about what could have been done differently. While some defended Dawson's initial suspicions, others argued that professionalism demanded erring on the side of caution and respect. These conversations encouraged future officers to reflect on their own assumptions and consider how their actions might affect those they encounter on duty. Public opinion remained divided on whether Dawson deserved forgiveness. Some believed he had already paid enough through the loss of his career and reputation. They pointed to his volunteer work and apparent efforts at self-improvement as evidence that he was trying to make amends. Others, however, felt that his past behavior warranted permanent consequences, arguing that trust once broken could never truly be restored. This tension reflected broader societal struggles with concepts of redemption and second chances. Despite these differing views, Dawson's story served as a powerful reminder of the stakes involved in policing. It underscored the reality that even well-intentioned individuals could cause irreparable harm if they failed to acknowledge their biases. This awareness prompted many departments to prioritize mental health support for officers, recognizing that unchecked stress and trauma could exacerbate harmful behaviors. Counseling services expanded, offering resources to help officers process their emotions and develop healthier coping strategies. Back in Hayes's life, the journey toward healing and advocacy came with its own set of rewards and challenges. Though he had found purpose in his role as a champion for justice, the emotional scars of his arrest lingered. There were days when memories of that evening resurfaced unexpectedly, triggered by something as simple as the sound of sirens or the sight of flashing lights. On those occasions, Elena reminded him to take a step back, breathe, and focus on how far he and society had come since then. "I'm proud of you," she told him one evening as they sat together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. "You've done so much good, Marcus, don't forget that." Hayes smiled faintly, squeezing her hand. "It's not about me," he replied. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." And indeed, the tangible results of his efforts began to emerge. Crime rates dropped in areas where community-police relations improved, thanks in part to initiatives inspired by Hayes's advocacy. Trust, though fragile, started to rebuild. People who had once feared calling the police for help now felt more comfortable doing so, knowing there were systems in place to hold officers accountable. Officers, too, reported feeling less isolated and more supported, as partnerships with social workers and counselors alleviated some of the pressures of their demanding roles. Of course, the road ahead wasn't without bumps. Resistance to reform persisted in certain quarters, and setbacks occurred along the way. But Hayes refused to let cynicism dampen his optimism. He knew that progress rarely followed a straight line. It zigzagged, stumbled, and sometimes even doubled back. What mattered was keeping the momentum alive, pushing forward despite the obstacles. As years passed, Hayes's legacy grew. He retired from the Navy as a 4-star admiral, celebrated not only for his military service but also for his contributions to social justice. Upon retirement, he published a memoir detailing his experiences, which became a bestseller and further amplified his message. Readers praised the book for its honesty, vulnerability, and unwavering commitment to hope. Schools adopted it as required reading, ensuring that future generations would learn from his story. For Dawson, redemption proved elusive. Though some forgave him, seeing value in his attempts to grow, others remained unwilling or unable to let go of the pain he had caused. He continued volunteering at the shelter, quietly dedicating himself to serving others without seeking recognition. Occasionally, he attended community meetings focused on reconciliation, listening intently to discussions about moving forward. He rarely spoke, preferring instead to absorb the wisdom of those around him. In time, Dawson came to accept that his name would forever be linked to a dark chapter in history. Rather than fight it, he embraced it as a reminder of the lessons he had learned and the work still left to do. Redemption, he realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a better future, however imperfectly. Ultimately, the intertwined stories of Admiral Marcus Hayes and Officer Greg Dawson highlighted the complexities of justice, accountability, and humanity. Their lives served as mirrors reflecting both the flaws and potential of society. Through their struggles and triumphs, they reminded us that while mistakes are inevitable, growth is always possible, and that true progress requires courage, humility, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of change. Years had passed since the night that changed everything for Marcus Hayes and Greg Dawson. The world had moved on, as it always does, but the echoes of their intertwined stories continued to resonate. For both men, life had taken unexpected turns, paths shaped by choices made in moments of crisis and reflection. Their journeys, though vastly different, shared a common thread: the enduring quest for redemption, purpose, and understanding. Admiral Marcus Hayes, now retired from active duty, spent his days mentoring young leaders and advocating for systemic change. His home office was filled with awards, letters, and photos commemorating milestones along the way, a testament to a life dedicated to service beyond the battlefield. Yet despite the accolades, Hayes remained grounded. He often said, "It's not about me, it's about what we can do together." This philosophy guided every decision he made, whether speaking at international forums or simply sitting down with a struggling teenager who needed guidance. One of Hayes's proudest achievements was the establishment of the Hayes Institute for Equity and Justice. Funded partly by royalties from his memoir and donations from supporters, the institute became a hub for research, education, and advocacy. Scholars, activists, and policymakers gathered there to collaborate on solutions to pressing social issues, from racial profiling to economic inequality. Programs like Youth Voices Matter empowered young people to share their experiences and propose innovative ideas for community improvement. The initiative gained traction quickly, inspiring similar efforts worldwide. Hayes also found joy in quieter moments, cherishing time with his family. His children were grown now, pursuing careers and dreams of their own. They admired their father deeply, not just for his accomplishments but for the values he instilled in them: empathy, resilience, and integrity. Weekends were reserved for family dinners, laughter-filled game nights, and long walks through the park where Hayes would recount tales of his naval adventures. These rituals provided a sense of normalcy amidst the whirlwind of public attention. Yet, even in retirement, Hayes couldn't escape reminders of that fateful evening. Occasionally, strangers approached him in airports or grocery stores, thanking him for his courage and sharing how his story had inspired them to speak up against injustice. Other times, memories surfaced unbidden: the sound of handcuffs clicking shut, the cold metal of the patrol car door, the weight of being doubted when all he wanted was to go home. On those nights, Elena would sit beside him, holding his hand until the storm passed. For Greg Dawson, redemption remained an uphill battle. Though he had distanced himself from the chaos of his former life, scars, both visible and invisible, remained. Living in a small town offered anonymity, but it also meant loneliness. Few people knew his full story, and those who did rarely extended kindness. Still, Dawson persevered, clinging to the belief that he could contribute something meaningful, however small. His volunteer work at the shelter evolved into a deeper commitment to helping others. Over time, he earned the trust of staff members who began assigning him more responsibilities. Dawson started teaching basic job skills to residents, guiding them through resume writing, interview preparation, and financial literacy. Seeing someone secure employment after months or years of struggle brought him a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in decades. "If I can help even one person turn their life around," he told a coworker once, "then maybe I'm not completely useless." Dawson's journey toward self-forgiveness was slow and fraught with setbacks. Therapy sessions helped him confront lingering guilt, but progress came in fits and starts. Some days he woke up determined to be better. Other days, despair threatened to consume him. What kept him going was the knowledge that he owed it, not just to Admiral Hayes, whose name still haunted him, but to everyone affected by his actions, to keep trying. Occasionally, Dawson attended community meetings focused on healing and reconciliation. Sitting quietly in the back row, he listened as speakers discussed the importance of empathy, accountability, and second chances. Once, during a particularly moving session, a woman stood up and shared her experience of losing a loved one to police violence. Her words cut deep, forcing Dawson to face the reality of the pain he had caused. Afterward, he approached her hesitantly, apologizing for his past behavior and expressing gratitude for her courage in speaking out. To his surprise, she accepted his apology, acknowledging that while forgiveness was difficult, it was necessary for healing. These interactions reinforced Dawson's resolve to keep pushing forward. He began documenting his reflections in a journal, chronicling his struggles and triumphs in hopes of leaving behind a record of growth. One entry read, "I'll never undo what I've done, but I can choose how to live today. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, is a step toward making things right." As the years went by, the nation continued to grapple with the legacy of that pivotal moment. Conversations about race, policing, and justice remained central to public discourse, fueled by ongoing incidents of discrimination and inequality. Yet, signs of progress emerged. More diverse voices entered positions of power, shaping policies that prioritized fairness and inclusion. Grassroots movements gained momentum, proving that collective action could drive meaningful change. And institutions, from schools to corporations to government agencies, began implementing reforms aimed at dismantling systemic barriers. Hayes and Dawson crossed paths only once more, years after their initial encounter. It happened by chance at a conference on criminal justice reform, where Hayes delivered the keynote address. Dawson sat in the audience, unrecognized among hundreds of attendees. As Hayes spoke passionately about the need for compassion and collaboration, Dawson felt a lump rise in his throat. When the event concluded, he lingered near the exit, unsure whether to approach the man whose life he had so profoundly impacted. Finally, summoning his courage, Dawson stepped forward. "Admiral Hayes," he said softly, extending a hand. Hayes turned, startled, before recognition dawned in his eyes. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Hayes nodded and shook Dawson's hand firmly. "Thank you for coming," he said simply, his tone neutral yet not unkind. Dawson exhaled, relief washing over him. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I know words aren't enough, but I mean it." Hayes studied him for a beat, then replied, "Apologies are a start. What matters is what you do next." The exchange lasted only seconds, but its significance lingered long after they parted ways. For Dawson, it marked a turning point, a glimmer of hope that perhaps someday he might find peace. For Hayes, it reinforced his belief in the possibility of transformation, even in the most unlikely circumstances. In the end, their stories served as powerful reminders of humanity's capacity for both harm and healing. Admiral Marcus Hayes emerged as a symbol of resilience, using his ordeal to spark conversations and drive change. Officer Greg Dawson embodied the complexities of redemption, grappling with guilt while striving to make amends. Together, their lives illustrated that while mistakes define us temporarily, our responses to them shape our legacies permanently. As history books recorded their tales, future generations inherited lessons about accountability, empathy, and the enduring pursuit of justice. Through triumphs and failures, Hayes and Dawson reminded us that true progress requires acknowledging the past without letting it dictate the future. And though their paths diverged irrevocably, their shared journey underscored a universal truth. Even in the darkest moments, light can emerge, if we choose to seek it.